Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by covering that incident that took place at the U.S. Capitol, or close to the U.S. Capitol at the very least, where a car rammed into a police barrier that had been set up. And this had been set up especially, of course, in the wake of the January 6th riots that took place around the Capitol building and in the Capitol building, in fact. In this specific incident, at least as far as I know, the word terrorism has not been used. This does seem to be a lone wolf incident. At this point in time, a police officer has been killed. Seemingly, he was the one, or she, who was the one who was rammed at the time that this incident took place. And now the suspect himself, there's a lot of talk about who he is, his background, whether or not he had mental health issues, as his own brother is claiming at this point in time. But beyond just that very specific incident that we can talk about at the Capitol this time around, there's also the greater issue of just insecurity as a whole, how exactly one can deal with mental health issues, which also play a huge aspect in anyone carrying out such an incident, as well as then the very real threat of domestic terrorism, as well as other forms of terrorism around the U.S. Capitol and government buildings, etc. Let's discuss all of that a bit further, and I'm joined by Michael Lane, who is the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. He's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Michael, good morning to you, and thank you for joining us. What do you make of what occurred close to the Capitol?
Well, Waqar, as you said in your introductory remarks, it does look like this was a lone wolf incident. As you pointed out, the authorities are not using the word terrorism associated with this particular event, at least yet. From what we do know, which is not a lot, it doesn't look like it was a terrorist incident. It looks like a guy who was very maladjusted. Whether or not that stems from some mental health issues or whether there were other things involved in it, we clearly at this point don't know, and the investigation may or may not tell us some of those answers. And so this guy, in his recent postings on Facebook, appears to have been very depressed about his lack of a job, lack of prospects. He graduated from college about 3 years ago. He was going places, and things turned around pretty quick in this pandemic, and he was just having very, very difficult time dealing with the whole situation.
Indeed. So, in fact, an aspect I wanted to hone in on, the mental health aspect. And again, we don't know that for sure, but that's what his brother has claimed, and that's what the reports have said as well. And as you can imagine, there is a lot of debate about any connection to Nation of Islam, direct connection, that is, because of that entire mental health issue altogether. But I don't want to get into that aspect of the NOI necessarily at this time, but just on the argument about mental health overall, right? How does that then complicate efforts to keep the country secure? Like, I mean, how does that play into the national security strategies, homeland security strategies? Because that's an aspect which I would think is a lot harder for anyone to be able to calculate from beforehand, right?
It is. It's very, very difficult, particularly in light of what we call HIPAA, which is a Health Privacy Act here in the United States that dates back some 50 years. When someone is diagnosed as having medical issues, be they mental or physical health, we bend over backwards in this country to keep those records private. Some would say secret. But they are considered to be very, very private to the individual and the healthcare providers that are treating this individual. So when there is a circumstance where you have someone who has a mental health situation and they are a danger, there's a lot of hoops that need to be jumped through. And in fact, some healthcare providers are reluctant to do so because if they falsely report, or inaccurately report, I think would be a better word, someone to authorities, it can come back and cause them problems in their profession, in their practice, et cetera. So we have been facing any number of violent circumstances here in the United States over years, over decades, where the real issue traces back on these people to mental health. There is a very, very strong theory that it's not necessarily the easy access to weapons. In this case, the guy had a car. There's no way you're going to keep somebody away from buying a car.
Exactly.
But the ability to carry out attacks and to carry out violence when you're a mental health circumstance has been manifest over the years. I would add at this point that it just, this guy himself, Noah Green is the name that he's been identified as.
Yeah.
Mr. Green was not on anybody's radar list. There are a lot of people with mental health issues that have manifested their problems out over a period of time.
Yeah.
And so the authorities are aware of them and they do keep a watch on them. But in this case, Mr. Green was completely unknown to authorities, and nobody has a plan to deal with these kinds of people, and they are becoming more and more and more relevant to the health and safety of American society.
When this incident first happened, a lot of us, and I was watching it almost live. I mean, I came to the breaking news fairly early on when it had first happened. And the initial thought was, probably mistakenly so, of course, as we know now, that this was going to be connected somehow to those warnings that January 6th may very well repeat, not necessarily in the same exact numbers, but in some regard, domestic terrorism, domestic extremism, the above. Do you think that that's been overstated, understated, that threat? Because there is also talk of rallies, right, for April 11th, in which Proud Boys may very well still play a part. I mean, how does one then assess that threat? And again, I'm not saying that that is connected to this specific incident.
Right. And in fact, it looks like this is not reflected to this particular incident. As near as I can tell, the first report that this was in some connection with that, in fact, it was identified as a white male was the perpetrator, which we know now was anything but a white male. As near as I can tell, was put out by the very, very liberal network MSNBC, and their social justice reporter, a guy named Pete Williams, is the one who said it was a white attacker. I haven't seen him retract that report yet, but obviously he was very much in error when he did that. Other networks and other news sources then picked it up from there. We look at what happened on January 6th, and I think it was horrible. No matter what you believe about that, it was horrible. You do not attack an institution of democracy here in the United States and have people not have a really visceral reaction to it. But when you get down into who those people were, there were more than a handful. I would say my estimate is maybe between 25 and 50 leaders of what they were trying to start an insurrection. And they were the ones who breached security at the Capitol, and they went even further, trying to incite the crowd. The rest of the people that went into the Capitol were foolish idiots who were out for a Sunday stroll. They saw, oh, the Capitol's open now, so we might as well go in and participate in this. They were not insurrectionists. They were not terrorists. These were stupid idiots who followed the crowd. But the 25 to 50 people who incited that riot are very, very dangerous people. As far as the reports, fairly widespread, put out that now the most significant danger to the safety and security of the United States is now right-wing terrorist groups. I think that's a political talking point. I don't think there's really more than 5% to that. There are a couple groups out there that are very dangerous, and they ought to be watched, and they ought to be arrested if something happens. But in terms of the bigger picture, I hadn't even heard about this April 11th thing yet, but let's not remember March 4th, which was when all these groups were going to come into Washington. That was historically the installation date of our new president under our Constitution before it was amended, and that probably a deity himself was going to bring Donald Trump in on the wings of angels and install him as the correct president of the United United States.
And that did not happen, of course. And I'm going to have to cut you off. Apologize, Michael. But no, this is a very good point to end off on. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. But we sincerely appreciate you getting up early in the morning to share your expertise with us. That was Michael Lane speaking to us from Washington, D.C. We always appreciate his time. But we were discussing there, of course, what's happened close to the Capitol. And of course, the initial thoughts on many of the networks, even just indirectly, was that this was possibly connected in some way to what occurred on January 6th. We now know that this is not the case. However, misplaced or not, that's what the initial thought was. And that, again, goes to show really that passing judgments from the get-go about any such incidents is always a bad thing. And that's been the case of other forms of terrorism as well, right? So if we're talking about quote-unquote international terrorism as a whole instead of domestic terrorism or right-wing terrorism, that's been an issue for a very long time, which a lot of us have been protesting against, saying that there always needs to be a deeper study of what the root causes of every specific respective incident are. And in this case, of course, we know that it's not related to January 6th. Nevertheless, that fear still very much remains because of what happened on January 6th and the desire for that not to be repeated again. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss that virtual meeting that was held between the signatories, or the remaining signatories, that is, to the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. From that meeting, what we've understood, and the main thing that's come out, is that there will be an in-person meeting now in Vienna on Tuesday between the remaining signatories to the party. The U.S. will have some form of presence there, even though it will not be involved in any direct talks with the Iranians around the table or otherwise. And that's something that the Iranians, as well as the Americans, have both pointed out and sort of underlined over and over again. Nevertheless, over the past week or two, there's been a lot of positive news that has been coming out seemingly about what may be happening behind the scenes and efforts to save the JCPOA. Now, the outstanding issue really for the Iranians, as they've said, is the lifting of sanctions, which they were promised under the JCPOA. That did not happen in their eyes. And then the Iranians have then, according to the JCPOA itself, have started slowly walking away from specific commitments that they had made within the deal as well, because one of the parties to the deal has not been living up to its commitments, as well as the other parties. The Iranians have a long list of complaints against the Europeans as well, and their efforts, or lack of in their eyes, of course, vis-a-vis saving the deal altogether. Let's put all these issues to our esteemed panelists who are joining us today. We're now joined by Hana, Attia, who is a research fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. She's joining us today from Hamburg. And joining us from Galway, Ireland, is Dr. Raymond Murphy, who is a law professor at the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the National University of Ireland, Galway. Raymond and Hana, thank you both for taking our time out today to join us here in Scope. Raymond, I'd like to start with you. The issue of sanctions still very much, at least in my eyes, remains, right, the outstanding issue. And do you think that there is really the impetus right now for that to really be resolved in any satisfactory fashion?
Yeah, the Irish Foreign Minister, when we took our seat at the non-permanent seat on the Security Council, said that this was one of the major challenges to the Security Council at present. And indeed it is. It does seem like that the United States administration is interested in resolving the issues that were created by President Trump. But the United States has domestic pressures in terms of just relinquishing or giving, changing the sanctions regime that it imposed. But it is fundamental to resolving this issue. The United States had made a commitment, an international commitment, an agreement with a range of states, including Iran, and part of that was the lifting of sanctions. So I actually understand where the Iranian regime is coming from in terms of setting that as a precondition to substantial talks to bring the actual agreement back into play. So I'm optimistic in the sense that what's happening is quite incremental and quite slow. but I have greater faith in processes that take place behind closed doors rather than open diplomacy where each side publicly declares what they need and demand. So perhaps the United States will have to be flexible in relation to the sanctions regime that it unilaterally put in place, and which in fact the European states tried to circumvent, but because of the strength of the US dollar and the strength of the United States economic power, it was not able to really effectively do.
What are your thoughts about, again, all this positive energy around this situation right now, right? I mean, Joe Biden, we know, came into office quite strong on this issue, saying that I want to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal. I would think that the moment he came in, he realized it was going to be a lot harder than what he may have originally thought, because Donald Trump did leave a lot of obstacles in his path to be able to re-enter the deal. It's not as simple as that anymore. A, geopolitically, the region has changed significantly since the U.S. walked away, and B, just the sanctions that have then been placed are a lot more complex than just snapping them back. Do you think the Europeans have the power to really, really mediate between these two parties at this time?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think the Europeans have been stuck in a very awkward position since Trump has reimposed the sanctions against Iran, where they were trying to save the nuclear deal, but at the same time preserve the credibility of the deal and keep Iran in line with the requirements. Since President Biden has taken office, we see that the EU was trying to pressure both parties in order to negotiate and to save the deal, because it is in the interest of all remaining parties. At the moment, there is no doubt that both the US and Iran, as well as the EU and the remaining party, want sanctions to be lifted and that they want to come to an agreement. So we see that Iran, yes, it has been building leverage in order to be in a position to negotiate an acceptable deal. But at the same time, the violations that Iran has conducted have been very transparent. And again, we see that Iran was trying to build leverage to be in a powerful position, but at the same time was trying not to risk alienating the EU and the remaining parties in order to still be in this position to say that they have been compliant up until President Trump reimposed the measures.
If I may come in, Hana, for a moment, and I'm just going to play devil's advocate. I don't want to sound pro-Iranian, but the Iranians would argue, as you well know, Hana, that within the deal itself, and yes, we can certainly argue till before the U.S. walked away what had happened, but I want to talk specifically the moment the U.S. walked away. The Iranians did, I believe it is, wait a year, right, before they started slowly removing commitments. And that is within Article 26, if I'm not mistaken, of the JCPOA, where they're allowed to do that because the other parties were not able to lift the sanctions that they were promised. I mean, is that a fair argument in defense of the Iranian side?
I think this is a difficult question to answer. I mean, the remaining parties stayed compliant to the deal, and the EU was investing a lot of efforts in order to help Iran and European companies circumvent the US sanctions that were imposed. However, what this has shown us, and I think this is the problem here, that the EU cannot compensate US losses. And I think this is what the EU knows right now, that they need the US to be on board in order to effectively and credibly lift the economic sanctions and the economic constraints that Iran is facing. And this is why we see that the EU is actively trying to mediate an agreement that would allow the US to lift the sanctions and at the same time to get Iran to comply again with the measures. However, that said, I agree with you in the sense that Iran has been in a position where it could say the US walked away first. And we see this also in the strategy that they have been pursuing. I refer to leverage that they have been accumulating. However, it was very transparent leverage and always balancing gaining power in negotiations, but at the same time not alienating the other parties, as said.
I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. This has all happened, especially, I mean, over the past year or so, within the context of a pandemic as well, right? So we've thrown that into the mix along with the sanctions. And then that just creates more bad blood and bad sentiment on the part of Iranians as well, right? So, I mean, there's also, and I would think so, that there is an understanding, I'm hoping, on the part of the Europeans and other signatories to the deal, pardon me, who are still in it, as well as the United States, that it's that much harder domestically for Iranians to then bow to pressure, right? I mean, do you think that that is an understanding that they're all coming to the table with?
I do, yes. I mean, to go back, I don't want to sound too biased either, but in the end of the day, the agreement was reached, and it was the United States that reneged on the fundamental aspect, which was the sanctions. And I think the situation is more complex now in many ways, because we're heading into an election, a number of elections, but critical elections in Iran. In the United States, though we have a new administration, it's rather precarious because of domestic issues, the balance of power within the Senate and the House of Representatives. So anything that President Biden actually agrees has to some extent find support within his own domestic constituency. So I'm still hopeful that both sides can compromise. But, you know, the behind the scenes, Iran has indicated, for example, that it wants some kind of compensation for the consequences of the sanctions. And they have been very harsh, especially on the economy and on the general population. So President Trump's strategy of maximum pressure on Iran was counterproductive and only hardened the resolve, in fact, on both sides. So there is a lot of work to be done, and the United States has to be the one to, I think, make the greatest compromise, simply because it was the state that violated what had been agreed in the past. And the European Union is trying to act as the honest broker here.
Very well. We'll have to leave it there at that. The clock has gotten the best of us, but we really appreciate both Hana and Raymond for taking their time out of their busy schedules this Saturday to share their insight with us. We discussed there just briefly, of course, that virtual meeting that took place between those who are still within the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. A lot of positive vibe, seeming a lot of positive talk about the U.S. coming back into the deal, possibly. It's not that simple, of course, because the Americans want the Iranians to first blink, essentially to roll back their what is seen as violations. But I mean, technically within the deal, this is allowed, legally at least. Now, of course, it's not helpful to the situation. It doesn't create trust that you would want. That's an argument that should be had. But at the same time, it is the Americans who walked away from the deal first, as Raymond there also pointed out. It's not simple. These are complex issues, but hopefully those Vienna talks on Tuesday will bear some fruit. Hopefully, maybe even before the Iranian elections, we might see a definitive result of whether or not Biden can really re-enter this deal altogether. This would be to the benefit, of course, A, of the Iranian people, certainly, and B, hopefully, for the rest of the parties who remain in the deal as well, for a more secure world. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss the normalization of ties between certain Arab governments and Israel, and the fact that, of course, as we know from day one, that it was the United States who mediated those normalizations, quote unquote, of ties between those two sides. There is now a bill that's been put forth in the United States to strengthen those ties and then to work and to force, essentially, in some ways, if we're completely honest, the Biden administration to continue that effort of normalization of ties, to strengthen those normalization of ties, to regularly report on its efforts, i.e. the White House's efforts, to then bring in others into the fore, to include them also within the normalization of ties. And it's even spoken of using the likes of, the State Department, USAID, Pentagon, and others to expand and strengthen those normalization efforts. So this is then, if I may use the term, holistic approach to ensuring that these normalization of ties are strengthened in every fashion that the Americans can so do. No mention of the Palestinians, really, apart from just a summary passing note that there should be a Palestinian state, but then no real talk of how exactly that is meant to come about through these normalization of ties, which has been the criticism of them from day one anyhow. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Kamel, Hawwash, who is the chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. He's joining us today from Birmingham. Kamel, thank you as always for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of this? I mean, yes, the normalization of ties has already occurred, but then why do the Americans need to be in the middle of this? I mean, if it is a normalization of ties between Israel and these respective Arab governments, why do we need a third party to be in the middle of it saying, oh, we want to strengthen these normalization of ties? I mean, to me, it sort of seems like this, it's just illogical in some ways, isn't it?
Thank you for having me, Waqar. Yeah, I mean, the starting point, I guess, is that one of the reasons why the 4 normalization agreements that have been signed already, to varying degrees, and maybe we can talk about that, have been successful, is that what the Americans told these people, particularly the Trump administration, was the route to the White House is through Tel Aviv. And therefore, they, in order for them to feel protected from the Iranian threat and so on. So while Trump was in the White House and while Jared Kushner was flying in and out of different countries, that was the message. If you want protection from America, if you want good relations with the White House, you've got to normalize relations with Tel Aviv. So I think those who are bringing this particular bill to Congress, what they think is they want to put pressure on the new administration, the Biden administration, to continue along this path of what they call the Abraham Accords, which I call subservience agreements rather than normalization agreements, because it's always on the Israeli terms that these are signed. So I do think it's an attempt to pressure the new administration to bring more countries to the table. So I do think that's what's behind it. It's saying this has got to be our position as as America to pressure more countries to normalize with Israel, and we need some money to do that. And I think that's what the bill is trying to achieve.
You know, the interesting thing, Kamel, is even in the normalization agreements, to the best of my knowledge, all of them, if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, do at some point in time say that the reason these normalization of ties are occurring is so that there can be a Palestinian state one day. I mean, that's always been the underlying narrative on the part of even these Arab governments, that we're doing this, listen, not ignoring the Palestinians, but in fact doing this for their sake. And that's also sort of the narrative underlying, at least in passing, in this bill as well, that this is all meant to be for the good of Palestinians. I mean, is this all just a charade? Why not just come out and say, listen, the Palestinians, you know, we don't really, I mean, why even mention the Palestinian cause? Is it that they're trying to save face, do you think?
I don't think the Palestinians really figure in this, and the test of that is with the United Arab Emirates. As soon as the accord was signed, suddenly and sort of supposedly surprisingly, though they've been working on these agreements for months, it's obvious, if not years, is that they immediately started thinking, oh, we need to import goods from the illegal settlements. Now, if the Palestinian issue figured in these agreements at all, there would have been a clear predicating, if we wish, on the maybe a staging even of the development of these agreements, depending on how Israel moved on issues like settlements, like the confiscation of land, like we see now, things like the ethnic cleansing in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, where Palestinian families that lived in houses before 1967 are going to be evicted as soon as the 2nd of May. So I don't think the Palestinians really figure in this. There is some reference generally by these normalizing states that not only can they normalize with Israel, they are still committed to the Arab Peace Initiative, or which predicated any normalization, that normalization followed an end to the occupation. Well, none of that has happened. So it is a charade, to use your word, that they talk about normalizing to help the Palestinians. I am sorry to say the Palestinians really do not figure in this. It's very much about this massive pressure from America on these countries to normalize, and the fact that each of these countries has managed to convince a small number of their citizens to be the public face of this normalization, when in reality, the overwhelming majority of Arabs reject normalization with Israel until the Palestinians have achieved their rights.
Indeed, Kamel, unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. We really, really appreciate, as always, you taking your time out of your busy schedule to share your insight with us. That was Kamel Hawwash speaking to us today from Birmingham. We were discussing this bill that has been put forth in the United States to support the normalization of ties between the Arab countries that have already normalized ties with Israel, and then, of course, to further that cause, to bring others into the group as well that is continuing to normalize ties with Israel. Why should the Americans even be involved in that process if it's meant to just be diplomatic ties between two governments, essentially, the Israelis as well as the Emiratis or others? And then at the same time, where does this leave the Palestinians altogether? As we were discussing there with Kamel, it does seem like a charade to even mention the Palestinians. Why not just come out and say, listen, we're doing this for our own interests, and it's not about the Palestinians. We're not doing this for the Palestinians. They are an afterthought or not even a thought in this process, because that is seemingly, if we're completely honest, the truth, which is something that I think all of us should just really accept. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a defense cooperation pact that's been signed between Jordan and the United States. Now, according to critics, more opposition activists and others within Jordan, the law was not followed, i.e. the constitution was not followed, that parliament was not consulted, that there wasn't a proper debate about this pact. There are concerns that because American forces who are going to be within Jordan will be allowed to carry weapons, that this is in part, of course, a violation of the sovereignty. There are, of course, other details within the pact which are also worrying to these opposition activists and others as well. What exactly is all this for at this time? Why wasn't the proper process followed? Or at the very least, why wasn't there more consultation on this issue? Or was there? Are these opposition activists and others all mistaken at this point in time altogether? There is a lot of talk about why the Americans would want such a pact as well. And there are, of course, geopolitical reasons for that, region-wise, et cetera, even looking further towards Asia, Russia, et cetera. Also, let's discuss all those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Hasan Almomani, who is a professor of international relations and conflict management at the Prince Al Hussein bin Abdullah II School of International Studies at the University of Jordan. He's joining us today from Jordan. Joining us from the UAE is John Lillywhite, who is a private analyst. He was formerly based in the Jordanian capital, Amman. John and Hasan, thank you both for taking our time out to join us this Saturday. John, let me start with you. What do you make of the Defense Cooperation Pact itself, as well as the criticism it's come under?
There's always been two countervailing trends within Jordanian history, if you go back far enough. And on the one hand, you've always had a long history of defense cooperation with Britain and America, really from the founding of the Jordanian state, if not before. And then on the other hand, you've always had this relationship where certain aspects of the political class and perhaps even the security class within Jordan have pushed back against that. And I think this is just really the latest iteration of that trend. And I would argue that in a way, what we're seeing isn't something that's entirely new. Jordan has always had very strong defense cooperation with Britain and America. I think over the past 4 years, particularly, Jordan's relationships with America haven't been as strong. And I think this is a way for the West to signal, and America in particular to signal, that Jordanian is a key ally, that the Jordanian relationship is very important. And that, as you, I think, referred to as well, this is a deal that is not just important for Jordan, which is in a tough world and, has a lot of questions on its borders, but also for the United States, which is hoping to play more of a global role in the world and not really be as locked down into the Middle East. So I think going forwards, this could be good for Jordan and it could be good for America.
Hasan, what are your thoughts about domestically, just within Jordan, the way that this was passed by royal decree? Should there have been more consultation with Parliament?
Good evening to you, Waqar, and to your guest. Well, in this part of the world, the criticism is so common. I mean, particularly when it comes to relations with the United States and the West. I mean, for many people, defense agreements or other agreements would always be criticized simply because of this sort of, preconceptualization of the relation between Jordan and the United States and so on and so forth in that respect. Well, I think from my perspective, probably why there is somehow criticism to the agreement is the timing of the agreement. Jordan has been going through sort of economic hardship, the coronavirus and the failure of the successive governments in terms of dealing the economy, in terms of dealing the pandemic. And of course, a few weeks back, there was this sort of salt accident where more than 6 people lost their life because of the shortage of the oxygen. So the public mood wasn't okay in that respect. And when the government officially published the treaty, it triggered this criticism from certain groups who are somehow usually would always criticize, relation between Jordan, United States, and this is because of this sort of collective memory of Western interventionism, Arab-Israeli conflict. And Waqar, you need to understand one thing, defense agreements always would be criticized. I mean, in this part of the world and elsewhere, I mean, in that respect. And here, let me say something that, I would say Jordan's strategic and military relations with the United States have preceded, this treaty. And this treaty is only probably to regulate this sort of agreement. And I think the issue of not sending the agreement to the parliament, probably this is sort of a problem. However, even if it was sent to the parliament, it would still be criticized by those groups. I mean, if you would take so many agreements. Yeah.
No, and Hasan, that you made some very pertinent points there. But John, I'm wondering, the argument on the part of some is that, listen, even if Parliament was meant to put obstacles in the path of such an agreement, that's actually the whole role of parliaments anyways, right? They're meant to debate. They're meant to make lives hard. That's what democracy is meant to be. I mean, is this indicative then in some ways that the democratic credentials then in Jordan are waning in some ways?
I mean, I take your point. I think, the point of the previous speaker about kind of domestic timing within Jordan and the perceptions of, people in Amman as to why this is happening now, fair enough. But I think in terms of democracy, I think it's always been understood that the head of state within Jordan has a very large and wide discretion over what happens in defense matters. And that's, very similar to some extent in my country, in the United Kingdom, where the Queen is the head of state. It's very similar in the United States, where we have this idea of the imperial presidency since 9/11 and the massive discretion that the office of the presidency has over, foreign deployments and security generally. So I think there's a well-established precedent across democratic countries all over the world, really. The head of state does have significant leeway to make these kinds of decisions. At the same time, as you said, there should be a debate on these things. And I think the fact that some members of the Jordanian parliament want to talk about this is possibly fair enough. But as I would say, specifically, if you look at the history of Jordan, going back to 1946 and before, there has always been a very, very strong presence of British and American troops on Jordanian land. They've been working together in deployments overseas for decades. And if you look at history, I mean, in the 1970s, you had King Hussein requesting American assistance. In 1956, you had King Hussein, rejecting Gladbasher and the British security role within Jordan. So it ebbs and flows. And I think if you do look at Jordan now internationally, there is a lot going on domestically. It is struggling. It's been through a very hard time with Syria on its doorstep, with Iraq on its doorstep. Under the Trump presidency, I think it was more isolated than it's used to being. And I think just the timing of this internationally and geopolitically means that, domestically it's not actually that new, but in terms of America signaling the Jordanian relationship, it's still important. I think, looking at it from a wider lens, this is just really an extension of how things were really working before, formalizing them in a way perhaps is a little bit unusual, but on the ground, not that much has possibly changed.
Point there. Hasan, we're quickly running out of time, so I want to give you the final word. We have about a minute and a half left. Just overall, I mean, on the macro issue of then a British/American relationship with Jordan overall, I mean, has that been an equal relationship? Because there is, as you well know, I'm sure, Hasan, outside of Jordan especially, there's been criticism that Jordan is in some ways very subservient to the two. Is that a fair criticism?
Well, Waqar, the issue of equality is somehow elusive in this respect. I mean, if you would speak of Jordan as a small rational state situated in a harsh environment, and if you would apply, small state geopolitical rationale in Jordan has always did its best to forge strategic relations with regional partners and international partners. Strategic cooperation between Jordan, United States, and UK has always provided Jordan with, I would say, or helped Jordan to secure its security and stability in that respect, and eventually provide Jordan with the ability also to maintain its sovereignty. So here, the issue of equality, I mean, one would question it, but if you would look at the whole issue from a holistic approach, such partnership has been paying off for Jordan in terms of military assistance, in terms of economic assistance, and so on and so forth in that respect. And moreover, Waqar, I mean, one would speak of those agreements in the age of globalization and interdependence. I mean, you would question this elusive term of equality and sovereignty and so on and so forth in that respect. At the end of the day, what matters for Jordan is its national interest, particularly in terms of security and, of course, stability, and to navigate safely through such rough seas in the Middle East and elsewhere.
All right, Hasan, I do apologize for cutting you off, but we sincerely appreciate both of you taking your time out this Saturday to share your expertise with us. That was Hasan speaking to us from Jordan, and John was speaking to us from the United Arab Emirates, both of them sharing their insight about this Jordan and U.S. Defense Cooperation Pact that has been signed through and approved through royal decree in the country. The criticism on the other side is that it didn't go through a proper democratic process as understood through the Jordanian constitution and system of governance that should have been debated, but then, was the other side essentially just looking for something to create obstacles for the sake of creating obstacles? Because, as John said, it's not like this sort of defense cooperation pact is a new thing. I mean, the reality on the ground is that the British and the Americans have been there for quite a while anyhow. So it's not like this changes a lot. It just sort of formalizes it a bit more. And as Hasan there was arguing, this is all, at least in Jordan's eyes, for its own national security and national interests. Again, an argument I'm sure that the other side would possibly debate as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.